Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I have a card to share with you using the Gathered with Love set, colouring on black cardstock with colour pencils. So let's get started. This is the beautiful Gathered with Love stamp set and I love this floral image in the centre. And I'm going to stamp it down onto some black licorice cardstock. So that's cut to 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. And I'm trying to centre it into the middle of that panel because this is going to basically be my finished card at the end of it. There's not much going on apart from the colouring, but I can always cut that down if it's not quite centred. I'm then going to ink up the stamp with a dye white ink. So ordinarily most white inks are pigment based. This one is actually dye based. It does have some pigment properties to it purely because it's very difficult to get a dye kind of based ink in a white colour, but it is slightly different than a pigment ink in that it dries pretty quickly. It's also not particularly juicy, if that makes sense. It's not very thick ink, which is really what I want. I wanted it to be fairly dull. I didn't want it to be too bright and I didn't want it to be too thick because I'm going to colour over the top of it, but you could definitely use a pigment ink here if you wanted to do the same kind of thing. And actually it looks really pretty and it's stamped really nicely onto this black cardstock, but I am going to pretty much cover it up. I'm using white ink today, although I'm not particularly going for a no line look necessarily. It is going to pretty much kind of blend into the colouring and maybe look a bit like white highlights. So although this isn't a pigment ink and it's not going to take ages to dry, I'm just going to heat that with a heat tool just to make sure it's completely dry. While that's drying, I did want to show you the difference between colouring on black cardstock as opposed to colouring on white cardstock if you've never done it before. So I'm using Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils for my colouring today, and I'm just laying down 3 blue shades so that you can see the difference between the different shades. And you can see that they look really nice on black cardstock. You can see the colour really well. But what I'm doing here is I'm laying down a base of the white pencil and then I'm going over the top with the exact same shades of the blues that I used first of all straight onto the black cardstock. And you can see the difference between them on the white pencil and then also on the black cardstock. They're a lot more vibrant, they're a lot lighter in shade as well, and we can use this to our advantage by colouring on black cardstock because you can use kind of like 2 methods to colour in the image, and I am going to use both here. But to start with, I'm using the second method where I'm laying down the white pencil to start with. So on all of these leaves here, I'm just taking that white pencil and I'm colouring in the leaf portions. And then I'm going to go in with my darkest shade of green, and this is pine green. And I'm going to add the darker shade towards where kind of like the bottom of the leaf is. I pretty much always gravitate to work darkest to lightest with colouring. I do the same thing with Copic markers and alcohol markers as well. It's just my personal preference, but it can be done either way. So just going over where that darkest area is. And then I'm going to go in with my mid-tone shade, which is leaf green. And I'm going to go over some of the area where I've already coloured with that darker green. And then bring the colour up towards where it will be the lightest shade. And I am pressing quite heavily. Ordinarily, when you're colouring with white cardstock with colour pencils, quite often you'd want to do quite a lot of layers to kind of build up the colour. But with the black cardstock, especially with the white pencil underneath, you can actually press quite hard. And in which case you can get away with not doing many layers, and so it's a lot quicker. So I'm going in here with my lightest shade, which is the light green, and I'm just blending those all out. And I did the exact same thing with all of the other leaves around the image. And now I'm going in with the stems, and I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm adding in the white pencil over the stems to start with, and then I can go over those with the green colours afterwards. And these bits here at the top, it does get a little bit, I don't want to say messy, it is slightly more difficult to be able to see exactly where everything is supposed to be with white ink rather than maybe like a black ink. But again, I'm going to use that to my advantage. And if I'm not happy where something is, I can always colour over the top of it and you're not going to be able to see it. So with this leaf here, I'm starting off by going in with that darkest shade again. And then I kind of jump here and I wasn't quite sure what part of the image I was going to colour next. But I am just going to go in for the stem, or at least this one. And I think I jump back to the leaf afterwards. And so I wanted the kind of top part of the stem that you see to be darker in the bottom, and then in the middle I'm going in with my mid-tone shade of green, and I'm actually not using the lightest shade on the stems, but I am going to use it on this leaf here. So again, I'm just going between the 3 different shades of the green. And if I'm not happy with some of the shading, I just go back, and you can go over it multiple times. But like I said, the good thing is you don't necessarily need to, because you can press a little bit harder. And then I'm going to bring in the white pencil and add some white highlights as well. And then I'm just going to go through the rest of the image here with all of the green parts, just doing the exact same thing. If I get some pencil where I don't want it, I can use an eraser, and I have like a fine tip eraser. I find it really quite helpful, especially using colour pencils in case you go outside of the lines. So just finishing off those stems here, just like I said, going through all of the different parts of this image with the greens. And then I finished all of those stems off, and now I'm going to start on the flower petals. So again, I'm going to add a base layer of this white pencil. And what I will say is, ordinarily the Polychromos white pencil isn't particularly vibrant, and it wouldn't be one that I would necessarily gravitate towards, but actually on black cardstock it does show up really quite nicely. So just adding that base layer of the white, and then I'm going to go in with my darkest shade of blue, and this is Helio Blue Reddish. So just adding that darker colour towards the bottom of the petal. And I wanted to show you here that although the tip of the pencil isn't too bad, I personally prefer the tips of the pencils when I'm colouring with colour pencils to be really quite sharp. So I did just sharpen that, and I do have an electric pencil sharpener which I really like, which is the Eye Point Halo. It's pretty decent price point, at least here in the UK anyway. And so yeah, I really like having really sharp points on the pencils if I can do. So next I'm going in with my mid-tone colour of blue, and this is Ultramarine. And again, I'm going over kind of where I've already coloured and then moving it upwards towards the top of the petal. And you can see here that I'm kind of going over the outside lines, but not always necessarily. And it's, like I said, it's going to make it kind of like it's a highlight rather than it's an outline like I've stamped it. I'm then going in with my lightest shade here of blue, and that is Light Ultramarine. And I didn't think I got a particularly good blend, so I'm just going to go back between the shades again just to add in some more shading. And just try and blend that out as best as possible. And I do go in with the white as well. And I kind of go over the line a little bit here, but again, it doesn't really matter, you'd never know, because I'm going over a white line anyway. So that's always quite helpful with kind of like the no line look. You can just make parts up if you really wanted to. And I kind of got a little bit of a smudge going on from the pencil, so I'm just using that eraser where I can, just to remove that from the outside of the image. So just going through this petal here at the bottom. And then I wanted to show you this one here. I want it to be quite a bit darker in that center portion. So I'm not going in with the white straight away, and I'm just going in with that darkest blue. And that's going to make it so that that is quite a bit darker. I'm then going over the rest of the petal with the white, but then going back in with that same shade of blue. But because I've got the white base down, this colouring over the top, although I used the same shade of blue pencil, is actually going to be quite a bit lighter. So it's quite good. You can kind of in some way fake that you've got a lot of shades of pencil, even though you maybe don't have that. So then I can go in with my mid-tone here, and this is where I'm kind of faking the outline, so to speak. It does kind of fold up on itself, but to be honest, I didn't think it would be that bothersome if I got rid of it, and it's just a bit easier to colour without it. So I just went over it completely, and the blue pencil covers over that white line, so it works out really nicely. And then I'm going in with the black pencil here, just to darken that area even more. So I'm just going to finish off here with this flower, and I left the centre of the flower as is because you've got that black cardstock underneath. It kind of makes it look like where it's stamped with the white actually is the highlight on the top of the, you know, bits in the middle of the flower, the stamens, rather than that they are actually white. So they would actually kind of be black, if that makes sense. So I quite liked how that turned out, and I didn't have to sort of do any colouring on those portions. I'm just going in here with that white pencil just to add some highlights, and then I finished off the other two flowers. Then for the vase, I wanted it to kind of look a bit like water is in it, but I also wanted it to look transparent, like glass, because you can see the stems through it. I don't think I quite got the effect that I was hoping for. I wanted to make it kind of look a little bit sketchy, but I think it did look a bit too sketchy. Like I said, I did struggle a little bit here. I'm using cobalt turquoise and cobalt green. I'm using some white as well, and then I do go in with the helio blue reddish as well, just to try and add some different shades into it. Like I said, I wasn't particularly happy with how it turned out, but the great thing about card making and colouring is that you learn by doing it. So next time I was to colour in this image, I would do better. And that's the great thing about card making in general, is that you learn from it. So the piece at the top, I decided to make it kind of look a little bit like it had like a metal rim on it. And so I'm using some warm greys for that. I'm using warm grey 5 and warm grey 2. And that is the colouring portion finished. So to finish off the card, I'm going to stamp a sentiment from the Gathered with Love stamp set onto some more black licorice cardstock. I'm prepping that with an anti-static powder tool, removing the excess powder, and then I'm going to ink up the image with Versamark ink. So I can just press that down, and then I can apply some superfine white embossing powder. I'm going to heat set that until it's completely melted, and then once it's cool I can cut that down into a strip. I'm then going to add some adhesive onto the back of the panel, just using some tape runner here, and then I can adhere that down onto an A2 size black licorice card base. So that's a finished size of 4 1/4 inches by 5 1/2 inches, and I did have to cut a little bit off of the right hand side and also the bottom just to make sure that they lined up perfectly. I've then added some black thin foam tape onto the back of the sentiment, and then I can place that down onto the card. I then wanted to add some white highlights onto the jug or the vase, whatever you wanted to call it, to kind of make it look a bit like glass, and that there would be kind of highlights on it. Again, I'm not particularly happy with the bottom, but the good thing is some of the sentiment does cover it over. But then I thought it'd be quite nice to add some kind of sprinkles and stars around the image itself. I'm using a 0.5 white gel pen for that, and I'm trying to make it kind of look a bit random. So it's always difficult when you're trying to make things look random, because actually technically they're not random because you're thinking about where they're going, but you know what I mean. So I'm trying to have some of the dots be bigger, some of them smaller, some of the kind of sparkly sprinkly bits a little bit bigger than others, and just sort of seeing where I want them to go. And I'm just finishing off with 2 here at the bottom. And so that's the card finished for today. I really love how those colour pencils pop against the black card base. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.